looks like we are live. I'm just setting up a couple things for the stream, then I will jump over to the drawing layout. I'm going to need to do a bit of an intro since we're doing something different today. I'll do that in just a sec here. Alright. Let's go ahead and switch layouts and get started here. I need to fix the status thing here. Alright, looks like things are switched over. Just testing out the canvas real quick, then I will go ahead and introduce what I'm going to be working on today. A couple housekeeping things from the last stream I did, which was the jam stream. I'm still using the same software and model that I've been using for streams up till now. And like I mentioned on the previous stream, due to changes to the capture software, my avatar moves around a lot more than I would like when I'm working on this stuff. It'll probably be like this at least for the rest of the streams this week. I'm in the process of finalizing the stuff for the upgraded model and troubleshooting some things with the capture software that I'm pretty sure I'm going to switch to. I talked a little bit about that last time as well. Just because it's a little bit distracting to have my model jumping all over the place if I just so much as move closer or farther away from the camera. So that'll be a thing for at least a couple more streams, and then once I move everything over to the new software, it should fix itself. Let me see if I can change the scaling here. I think as long as my head is visible and I'm able to talk, that should be fine. we'll leave the music balance like this for now, and as people jump on, I can make sure the balance is still good and I'm not getting drowned out by the background music. I'm going back to the Game Chops playlist on Spotify after the last drawing stream, which got flagged with a whole bunch of copyright claims. I am planning on uploading that particular stream soon. I had to take some time to edit it, and I think I took care of all of the music. I'm gonna probably upload that later in the week on the YouTube channel so people can see what we did in the last drawing stream. Alright, I think that'll do it for setup. Alright, so to kick things off, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I plan on working on today for the stream. And this particular project is probably going to take place over several streams. It'll depend on the progress I make today, as I think I'll need to talk a little bit through the process and explain what I'm doing. And then once I sort of explain how this is going to work and how the format works, then I won't need to explain it again, and we can sort of move through each phase. So a little bit of background. I talked a bit about it on the debut stream. I think I've mentioned it here or there. It's probably been a little while since I've talked about it, but my favorite video game series is Monster Hunter. I haven't been able to do any Monster Hunter related content on the channel so far, mostly because there isn't anything game-wise that I can easily play on the channel. And I haven't quite decided if that's going to be a thing later. It'll sort of depend as things develop. But I've been playing the Monster Hunter games for a really long time, since the late 2000s. And it's been a series that's been near and dear to my heart. And one thing that's always been interesting to observe on the internet, going back a ways, I would say probably around 2010-ish, maybe even earlier, is the concept of character fusions. And if you've been on the internet for a while, chances are you probably know what I'm talking about when I mention character fusions. But to real quickly summarize with a diagram here, the specific fusion format I want to talk about as it applies to what we'll be doing here on this particular project is triple fusions, or tri-fusions I've heard them called. And when you do a tri-fusion, it starts with a pretty simple diagram. I'll just explain how people normally do this. You have fusion component A, fusion component B, and fusion component C. And what artists will do when they're experimenting with this particular format just tweaking the positioning of the model. It's hard to tell where exactly the sweet spot is. But if we have three different components, characters A, B, and C, for the fusion, you take the two characters and you fuse them together to create fusion 1, fusion 2, and fusion 3. And the way that works is the fusions themselves are combinations of design and character elements of each of the components to create something completely different. So in the diagram here, Fusion 1, as I have labeled here, I'll just put them in boxes. This is just a rough diagram. Fusion 1 would have components of character A and character C. Fusion 2 would have components from characters A and B. And then likewise, Fusion 3 would have components of character B and C. And when you follow this format and create your Fusion characters using this template, you do this 3 times, and then you do one final fusion, which would be number 4, which takes elements of fusions 1, 2, and 3 and puts them all together into one amalgamation as the final result. And people have done this with characters from all sorts of media. They've done it with cartoon characters. I've seen it done with anime and manga characters, video game characters, you name it. It doesn't even have to be characters from the same medium. I've seen people take, let's say, a video game character here and a manga character here and maybe an animal or something down here, something really kind of out there, and they'll do this exercise of fusing all 3 together in this combination to get 4 unique creatures or characters or what have you. So in order to experiment around with some ideas and to try something a little bit different here on the channel, I want to attempt this experiment with Monster Hunter monsters. And this is not something that's necessarily a unique concept. I've seen a lot of really talented artists online do fusion exercises with monsters from the video game franchise, since there's a pretty big library of creatures going across many games and many systems, and people have tried their hand at fusing them together to create new results. So that's what we're going to do for this project, and we'll see how it goes. And interestingly enough, this project is actually something I started a while ago, just as an independent project in my free time, and I wanted to return to it and flesh it out a little bit more, so I decided to make it the focus of some drawing streams here to move that project along and get some good results, hopefully. So before I talk about the initial experiment that I did for this particular fusion, let's set the ground rules and sort of the structure for what we're going to be working with here. So this is my sample list, and what I did was I picked 3 creatures from the Monster Hunter library spanning several of the games, and I picked 3 creatures that I thought would yield interesting results while still being creatures that I was fond of. Again, there's dozens upon dozens of different monsters in the series that people have drawn fusions of, and I don't know if this particular combination is going to be unique, but it was one that sounded interesting to me, so I chose it. So as part of the intro for the stream today, I want to talk a little bit about who the components of the fusion are, what they're about, and how we're going to go about fusing them together. And just in case folks that are watching this may be completely unfamiliar with the Monster Hunter series or the creatures in it, I'll just talk a little bit about the three components as an intro here, and then I will refer back to this diagram at some point, since this is going to serve as the references for the creatures as well. So who do we have here? Fusion component A. This monster is called Zinogre. And Zinogre was a monster that debuted in the third generation of games in Monster Hunter Portable 3rd. And this particular monster is considered a fanged wyvern. The classification of species in Monster Hunter, everything's a wyvern, even if it's not technically dragon shaped. But Zinogre is a lightning wolf-like creature. It's quadrupedal, has pretty well-developed forelimbs, and spiky armor and plating all over its body, and fur. Sort of white fur that shows up on its chest and on its head, running all the way to its tail. And it has this pretty neat color scheme that's a mix of kind of gold and teal and silver. I would say Zinogre is probably my second favorite monster in the series, which is why I wanted to choose it for the fusion here. I figured it'd be a good challenge. Fusion component B. This one is Nargacuga. And Nargacuga was a monster that debuted in the second generation, I think that's considered, of Monster Hunter games. It was the flagship for Monster Hunter Freedom Unite on the PSP, which was the first Monster Hunter game I ever played. And Narga is considered a flying or pseudo-type wyvern, I believe. It's got kind of a mix of kind of panther and bird attributes. It has wings on its forelimbs, and the wings themselves have these sort of sharp blades on them here and here, and it can use those as a means to attack in addition to mobility. And Narga's cool. It has a pretty simple dark black or dark blue color scheme. It's kind of a stealthy and nimble creature that you fight. Of all the monsters in the series, Narga's my favorite. So I figured I would see how I can work its design elements into a fusion. And then the third component of the triple fusion here, this is Volvidon. And species-wise, Volvidon is a fanged beast. I believe that's the way it's classified now. And Volvidon's kind of like an bipedal armadillo anteater. It can walk on its hind legs, sort of upright, or it can be on forelegs quadrupedally like it shows in the concept art from the game. It has a tough armored shell that covers its body and a long tongue it can use as a means to attack. And Volvidon's also capable of curling itself up into a ball like an armadillo. It can roll around and attack. It's a pretty entertaining monster to fight. And shape-wise and attribute-wise, it's very different from these other three. And also in color. The color palettes for these three monsters are pretty different. We have sort of a mix of brighter shades here, darker shades here, and almost a solid red with kind of a gold underbelly color for the third one. So in adhering to the rules of a triple fusion, this is the diagram that we're going to be working with. And end goal will be to get to 4 unique creatures that follow the rules of the fusion in combining elements from the initial components, and then the final sort of main fusion at the end will combine attributes of all of the fusions into one cohesive creature. And what I have done when I was working on this in my free time is I had started doing some creature concept sketches for a base primary when I was working on this, before I decided I wanted to also to continue the project on stream here as an experiment. I had started doing some primary sketches that was a follow-on to the initial creature design that I did, and that would be fusion number 1. The combination of Zinogre and Volvidon is actually one that I have drawn and rendered previously when I was first starting this project ages ago. And that one, if I jump over this other tab, looks like this. And the name of this particular fusion, taking the names of Zinogre and Volvidon, I'm calling this one Vulgar. Can put a little name thing here just for reference. And if you take a look at the combination of attributes here, the main body type that I chose for this particular fusion is the sort of upright, quote-unquote, bear skeleton, since the majority of the creatures that use a skeleton in-game are these kind of bear-like creatures, and that comes from Volvidon itself. And the fusion elements that were sort of combined from its components would be the sort of red skin and shell-like protection of Volvidon you see on the head, going all the way down the body and the arms, and the torso, and the tail, combined with the lighter fur and sort of dark greenish blue claws of Zinogre. The parts of the jaws here and parts of the face are sort of a combination of elements from both creatures. And then this particular fusion retains the long anteater-like tongue from Volvidon. And overall, it's a design that sort of highlights some of the notable features from each of the components. And this is the type of end result we're looking for when it comes to the fusions. And I'm not going to add this one to the diagram yet because I may decide to redraw this one at the end, depending on how the results of the other fusions go. I'll have to think about it. But I wanted to show that one because it was sort of the genesis point for this particular fusion project when I started working on it a while ago. And I want to build on those ideas for the other components and just see what results turn up in the process. Alright, I'm gonna hide the fusion diagram. I'll probably pull this thing up from time to time to get the references and do sort of a design element check. The main point of today is not going to be getting to a fully rendered drawing. The main point here will be to come up with some sketches and primaries. It's going to give us a base to work on when it comes to drawing out and rendering the final products for the remaining two fusions, and then we'll revisit the first one I showed a second ago at the very end and make a decision on that one. So like I mentioned, this is meant to be an experiment, and we'll see how it goes. I wanted to switch up the focus of the drawing streams a little bit today and try something new. All right. What I'm gonna do now. Hey, what's up, Edward? Welcome to the stream. How are we doing on audio? Everything should be coming in clearly since I'm just using settings from the previous stream. I know I'm having issues with my model jumping around due to the software update I mentioned in the last stream, but on the audio side we should be good. All right. What I've got pulled up here on the canvas is some rough sketch primary work I was working on previously. Okay, thanks, man. I know I always bug you to do my sound checks, but you're usually the first one to come in here and chime in, so I appreciate the feedback. Alright, so on the experimental primary sketches here, I started playing around with some ideas for this fusion number 2. If you look at the diagram, this is going to be combining the Fanged Wyvern Zinogre and the Flying type Wyvern Nargacuga. And the first thing I always do when working on a project like this is try and come up with a basic classification of the body type that I want to work with for the particular fusion. So again, we've got 3 different body types and species classifications with the 3 monsters in the exercise. We have the Fanged Wyvern, Flying Wyvern, and the Fanged Beast for the 3rd one. So because we're fusing a Fanged Wyvern, which is Zinogre, and a Flying type, which is Narga, I decided I would choose for this particular fusion the Fanged Wyvern type, aka the body type for Zinogre. And that's what you see in the primary sketches that I was experimenting with here. I was messing around with some body poses for the primary, trying to get a good idea for where I wanted the initial shape and quote unquote pose for the creature, where that I wanted that to go. And then as you see here on this side, I started messing around with some more detailed sketches of the head and face. The sort of pose I had gone with in this particular primary is this kind of crouched ready to pounce looking pose. I guess what I could do is jump over to a new layer and see if any other poses sort of jump out at me, and just experiment with primary shapes before I start working on an actual sketch that's gonna become the actual drawing itself. What I'm doing here is just taking some rough shapes and sketching out some potential poses as we kind of experiment around here. Again, like I mentioned earlier on, for the folks just tuning in, the point of the exercise today isn't to get to a final rendered drawing. I think this particular project's going to take a lot longer than some of the other ones that I've been working on. So I mostly wanted to use today's drawing stream as a brainstorming session to get some ideas together, and then either on the next one or on future sessions we can build on those ideas, and this is going to be sort of a long-term project. Alright, let's jump back and forth between our sketch here and our reference. For this particular fusion, we need to sort of focus on a body type, in addition to just the pose and the general body language of the creature we're drawing here. We need to give it a build. We need to be somewhat consistent in sticking to a build between the different fusion components. And Zinogre definitely has a bulkier, kind of more stocky build compared to Nargacuga. Zinogre looks like he hits the gym and bench presses all day. Narga looks like it does cardio and is a bit more sleek. I think for this particular combination of the two, I think I'm going to go for the bulkier route. And then next time we have a fusion that involves Narga, we can probably flip things a little bit and go for a more sleek build so that we're not just following the same build and getting kind of stuck into a one-dimensional approach here. I keep redrawing the head because I'm trying to figure out the head shape. Give this thing a bit more of a neck. I'm gonna make sure to keep saving as we go along here. I will say, building off of something I mentioned in the jam stream over the weekend, I had mentioned that where I live is seeing incredibly hot weather at the moment. That is definitely true today. Yesterday was worse, but even today it's still pretty decently hot. And in my recording space where I'm working here, because I can't run my air conditioner unit without it sounding like there's a wind tunnel around me on stream, I am once again entering the sauna, so it is quite warm today. But it's a good thing I didn't try and stream yesterday, or it would have been even worse. Okay, let's compare this new primary with the one here. I think this second one that I'm working on is going to be a little bit easier to work with, even though it's a little bit less dynamic. The pose here on this sketch sheet would definitely be a better action pose and sort of show off the body language and behavior of the creature, but it's a bit more densely cluttered together, if that makes sense. I could probably expand it outwards, make it larger and get more detail, but I feel like this other one, while it's not quite as dynamic, is going to give me a bit more room to get the actual details of the drawing. I think I'm going to go with this one and start working on some rough details, clean up the outline a little bit, and then I'll probably end up doing a couple primaries think one thing I talked about in the previous drawing streams is when I'm working on a concept drawing, I will usually do a couple different primaries once I have a rough pose sketched in and start putting different details on top of the primary until I have a complete sketch, and then I do the line art or something like this. That's gonna probably take a couple iterations. And I actually want, let's see, I want this face on a separate layer because I don't want to use this particular face as a reference. It may not be the final version of the creature that we draw, but it is going to be useful in sketching out how we want this thing to look. So I'm going to separate it from the other layer. That way it's not cluttering up my other primary. There we go. In fact, maybe easier if I do this. Put you down here. We'll drop the opacity a little bit. Actually, do this. Trying to give myself a layout that's going to allow me to look at my references and also not completely clutter up my drawing space. I'm used to doing this across multiple monitors, so I'll have my references over on another monitor and be working on my canvas here, but for the sake of showing folks what I'm working on, I want it to be in one spot, and I may be just hiding layers a lot. Hey, what's up, Game Attack? Go, go, go. Thanks for dropping by the stream. We're just getting started with drawing stuff here, so I don't really have a lot to show off, but appreciate you stopping in and taking a look. All right. Now we have a very rough primary. I'm going to start sketching in some potential details on a layer above. I'm going to use the face reference down here as well as our source material here and here. Lighten this up a little bit more. You can see what I'm working on. Looking at our references here, one of the key features of Zinogre on its face specifically are its horns. Look at the drawing reference here. It's got two forward swept horns that are very sharp and pointy. And on every iteration of this particular monster in the series, it's always had those horns. And I think when it supercharges and its fur and parts of its shell stand up, I think the horns actually pop upwards as well. I have to go back and look at gameplay footage to see if that's been consistent. But when it comes to signature design elements we don't want to ignore, if we're putting this one together, including the horns, I think is going to be important. What I'm doing here is trying to adapt parts of the mouth from both fusion components here. This version I've got down here in the corner that I was experimenting with sort of takes the jagged sort of shell-like jaws in Zinogre and this beak, which is a little bit tough to see when I'm zoomed out this far, but on Narga it has this upper and lower jaw, sort of bird-like beak on its face. I'm trying to combine both of those elements into something here for the fusion. Alright, I'm going to keep experimenting around with parts of the face and make my way down towards the torso. Again, we're still at the experimental sketch phase of the drawing. Nothing here is really final. We're just trying to get some ideas together as we experiment with getting both the pose and the body structure for the fusion here. as we work our way down towards the, I'm gonna hide the diagram real quick. As we work our way down towards the body for the creature, I want to keep the sort of furred body of Narga, but also work in some elements from Zinogre, which has got more of a tough shell and spots that protect its body. I think one of the best places to do that would probably be the forearms. Since for Zinogre, that's the most sort of pronounced part of its upper body. I'm adding some rough detail for the paws here. I like the idea of giving this plating on the arms sort of more sharp edges. Almost look like it's wearing a bracer type piece of armor. Let's see, for the hands. For the hands, we can see how the hands look on both and see if we can meet somewhere in the middle. Alright. The style of hands is kind of similar between the two monsters. They both have 3 fingers, and they're sort of paw-like. If you take a look at this one here, and here. One of the big differences on Zinogre are these additional talons that are on the side. And we're definitely going to work on something that's going to carry over that design element. I think if we do something like this, then I think that's going to be consistent with both creature components in the fusion, and that's the main point of the exercise here. not going to worry too much about the symmetry here. Again, we're just rough sketching in here. But going back to the fusion components, I mentioned these claws right here on the sides of Zinogre's hands, as it were. And previously, when we were talking about the design elements from Narga, I mentioned these things here. I don't know what you call them. They're like wing fingers? Wingers? I don't know what the actual term for that on flying animals is. I've always wondered that. But these extensions here on the wings are blades. And I figured a good way to keep that particular design element intact would be to give the fusion creature here these blades on its hand. They're not necessarily going to be as large as Narga's, since they're not part of wings. This creature doesn't fly. But the idea that they're part of the hands and can be used like a weapon, I think, would be consistent design element wise, as keeping with the different components of the fusion. And by adding that, I'll have to give it some thought, but this particular design element is seen on another monster from the Monster Hunter series that debuted somewhat recently with Rise coming out. And that particular monster was Magnamalo, the flagship for Monster Hunter Rise. It actually has these blade things on its hand. So I'll definitely have to think about how I want to differentiate that. But I'm going to keep that here as a placeholder, since I think it has potential to work in from a design element perspective. A game attack. I'm doing alright today. Where I live, it is incredibly hot, but other than that, I'm doing okay. How are you doing? Alright, well, hopefully the audio is coming in. If there's any issues with the audio as you're hanging out, let me know. I think we have everything set up, so the stuff from my mic as well as the background music should be coming in pretty clearly for the stream here. Alright, what I'm working on here is I'm roughing in some detail going down the back of the creature. I like the idea that there's sort of a shelled section that runs down the spine, sort of in between. If this thing has fur across its body, but it has sections where it has armor, I think that'll be a good sort of middle ground of combining the design elements from Zinogre, who's got the shell, and Narga, which is mostly a mix of fur. It has kind of these scaly sections on its limbs and its tail, but the majority of its body is covered in fur. I have to figure out what I want to do with the legs. We'll see when we get there. Could do something like this where the shelled layer going down the back goes all the way towards the tail. I haven't quite decided what I want to do with the tail yet. That's gonna be kind of a key thing to pay attention to for this particular combination. Do something like this for the legs. Basically have fur coming down to the end of the knee, and then from the lower leg all the way down to the feet has the same shell to match the hands. I think that could be a good way to handle that. Let's take a look at our references and get sort of a comparison point for how the feet look. It's hard to see in this particular picture, but Zinogre's feet sort of follow the same function and patterning as its hands. Has this sort of sharp plating that makes it almost look like it's wearing gloves and boots with the way the texturing comes off. And it doesn't have any fur on its limbs except for this trailing tufts on the edges. So if we take a look at our primary, we can sort of build on that idea for the fusion. We can give it these sharp edges that match what we've done on the hands. We should probably be consistent on the number of toes, though. We had 3 on each, not 4. Yeah. 3 toes. Should be easy enough to fix. Just need to adjust the way the foot's sort of aligned here. Again, this is just the rough primary, so I can fix this when I start doing some more detailed stuff before we get to line art. All right. I think we're looking good on the lower body. I'm just experimenting around with fur patterns and seeing how the texturing is going to look. Nothing is final. Again, we're just working on rough sketches here. I will probably say that a million more times before we get done. All right. Now we need to take a look and figure out what to do with the tail. To compare and contrast the design elements here, Narga has a long tapered tail, and when you're encountering this creature in the games, it'll try and smack you with its tail, and at some point when you make it mad, it'll sort of rustle its tail spines that are normally laid down flat, and its tail will get sort of this spiky look like this. I'm going to do a real crude drawing of what Narga's tail looks like when it's spiky. But it's got these quills and barbs that sort of poke upwards when it does this, and it can launch them like projectiles or just smack you for even more damage. It's definitely one of the more dangerous features. Zinogre has a more flat tail, almost like a beaver. It's hard to see from the render here, but if we were looking at it from the top down, if this is the tail, it sort of flattens outwards as it gets towards the tip, and it has sort of like a pronged shape to it. And then it's got fur that runs along it, and it's got spikes too. A bunch of the attacks that Zinogre uses also involve smacking with its tail, usually when it's flipping around doing its breakdancing attacks. But for our fusion, I thought a little bit about how I wanted to address the tail. And keeping with the theme of the whole creature being relatively furry, save for this layer of plating that runs along the top of the tail and the spine. I think the idea of a long tail it sort of tapers outwards, but has some spikes on the end, might be a good way to sort of split the difference and combine the different attributes. So we can sort of experiment around and see how that would look. Essentially, you might have a situation where the furred part sort of ends right before it gets to the tip, and then the remaining part matches this sort of shelled look that we've got on hands and feet, and resembles more like a club or a mace. What I'm going to do here is sort of experiment around with the patterning and see what it looks like. You can even change the way it tapers, make it more like tapering to a point. Do something like this. I've got an idea. We'll see if this works. This is sort of something I had on the previous sketch. Not quite as fleshed out. what I've done here is I've given the fur on the tail sort of a more top half trailing edge. Instead of being the whole tail, it's basically the top. If I were to explain what I'm trying to do here, if this is the tail side view, it's got a layer of fur on the top, and then a sort of like an under belly or non-furred part that runs underneath that layer, and then you get to the end like that. And this is similar to what's actually on Zinogre's original design. Again, it's not the best view from the render here, but its tail has a layer of fur here. That's not very easy to see. On the top and along the sides, and it's sort of sandwiched in between these rows of shell-like plating, which from a biology standpoint, I know doesn't really make a ton of sense, but it's a video game, so it doesn't have to. So taking that idea into account, if we had the fur running along the top half of the tail instead of covering the whole thing, then we have it taper off towards the tip, and then the rest of it is this sort of shell-like patterning here. Again, we can fill in the details on the tail a little bit more once we start finalizing the layout here, but I think as far as figuring out how to do a combination of the tails, I think that'll work. Okay, I'm gonna do some cleanup on the basic sketch layer for the face. Then we'll zoom out and sort of take stock of what we've got so far here. Okay, let's sort of take stock of what we sketched in here. I'll erase all this random clutter around. Get rid of that. Get rid of that. Hide the primary. If we compare the starting concept down here, keep drawing and erasing my arrows. Our initial idea for how to do the face, I think, is more or less intact. We've got the rough plating on the jaws, the beak part towards the jaws, the tip of the jaws, and then the way the plating sort of continues backwards, going along the lower jaw and the throat. And then it sort of cuts off right at the base of the neck before we get into the torso. One thing that's different on this updated version compared to the initial sketch that I pasted in here is the plating on the back. And I think what we've done here on this version makes a little bit more sense from a biology standpoint, because on this one, the initial sketch here, you have the horns and then they just sort of end right on the top of the head, and then it just goes into fur for the rest of the body. You could do that, but it doesn't necessarily make sense why a creature would have features like that. If we're considering this like protective shells or plating running down the body, it wouldn't make sense for it to just have a pair of horns and then for it to stop. Unless we wanted to make it more like antlers where they're growing directly out of the skull. But that's really not in line with what our fusion components have here. For Zinogre specifically, it's actual shelled plating, which you can't see since it's kind of behind where the camera is focusing. But the horns are also continue back into more of this plating behind the head. So this particular idea that it just stops right at the top doesn't necessarily track. Plus, having the plating go all the way down the back gives us a chance to add things like these spines here, dorsal spines. Just doing some cleanup on the legs. Here. I don't think there's really much we need to change there. I was a little bit worried that the pose we've chosen here would obscure the lower body too much, but I think it turned out to not be an issue. And what we could mess around with before we sort of finalize the sketch is talk about color palettes. Since again, I'm not going to be doing a fully realized and rendered drawing as part of this stream. This intro to the Fusion project was meant to be more of a brainstorming session to get primary sketch and give us a place to work from, so when we jump back in next time, I can go straight into line work, color assignment, shading, and final rendering. But if we're talking about color scheme, maybe we can do it this way. Okay, this is going to be my color palette experimental layer, and I'm going to mess around with some combinations of colors, and we'll sort of see if we can pull together something that's going to make sense for the fusion creature here so we can use it later. If we look at Zinogre's base color palette, we've got sort of a teal color for its skin, got a lighter gold, almost metallic looking shade for a lot of its shell, plating, and horns. And then for its fur, we've got a lighter silver gray. And then for claws, claws are kind of an interesting color. They're very similar to the teal, just darker, kind of a dark emerald color. For Narga, we have a base color that's very dark blue, almost jet black. We have some highlights around its eyes, which is one of its defining features when it gets enraged, where it turns red. Let's see. We've got sort of a darker maroon color on the wings. This is the fleshy part of the wings, the webbing. And its claws are sort of a dark gray, very close to the body in color, almost undistinguishable in tone from the body itself. When it comes to figuring out a palette for this particular creature, I guess the biggest thing to decide from an ecology standpoint would be, how does this thing behave? Is it a swift and stealthy hunter like Narga and needs to blend in the shadows and sort of take its prey by surprise? Or does it function more like Zinogre, a brawler that doesn't bother with stealth or hiding and overpowers its prey with brute force and sort of an in-your-face type of approach that doesn't rely on sneaking or stealth or anything? And looking at the way this creature is built and all of the design elements we've tentatively incorporated from the two fusion components, I'm thinking this one's going to definitely be more on the side of a non-stealthy creature. Its build and its posture and overall a lot of its attributes gear it more towards something that's going to use brute force, vice, something that's going to rely on agility and the element of surprise. So if you take that into consideration, we don't necessarily need to stick with a darker color palette, but pulling in some of those darker elements might not be a bad idea from a design standpoint. So what I'm gonna experiment with here if we have our two respective main color palettes from the fusion components, I'm going to sort of pick and choose and try and come up with a basic color palette for the entire creature, and save that for later when we actually get line work done and when we have a piece that's ready for color assignment. So this is sort of reading ahead in the assignment, as it were. So let's see, we have a creature that's mostly fur on the majority of its body. We could do a mix of sort of a silvery fur trying to think of what would be a good color for the plating. Do we want to match the sort of gold and vibrant color plating for Zinogre, or do we want to give it a contrasting darker color? We could go for a mostly silver color on the body. Give the area around the eyes the same highlights that Narga has. But we could go for a darker color on the claws and the blades on the hands. In fact, it may be best if I put actual assignments of color, just placeholders on the body, so I don't forget in case I don't come back to this for a little bit. So we do silver, gold, dark blue, could do something like put the teal color on these under sections here, and then make the spikes on the tail the same dark color. Do something like that. Again, this is just preliminary ideas for where to put the color. When I go into finalize the sketch layer and work on line art, this whole thing is going to be hidden. You won't be able to see it. This is mostly just to give me an idea of where the colors could go, just for future reference. Keep our assignment consistent. I think that's not a bad start for a tentative color palette. Once I actually get to color assignment, I can start experimenting around once I start putting all of these things into the respective sections on things like the face, the body, the limbs, whatnot. And if it clashes too much or it looks weird, I can always adjust it. Alright, I'm going to keep that palette layer. That'll be for future reference. I'm going to hide it for now. Let's pull up the fusion diagram and sort of do a status check on what we've got so far. Taking stock of the design elements we've tried to put together here. I think we've captured the majority of the significant design elements here. In between now and when we revisit this particular project to start finalizing and quote-unquote inking the concept drawing itself, I'll give some thought on any other changes I'd like to make. I think the biggest challenge was coming up with a pose that's going to give me something to work with and not be too much of an obstacle when it comes to combining things. So to recap, for folks who might be dropping in on the stream and miss the intro, the end goal of this project is to come up with 4 unique fusions of creatures from the Monster Hunter franchise series of games. Our first subject, which I've done previously, combines Zinogre and Volvidon, which is how you get this one here. The one that we spent the majority of time on stream today, brainstorming and sketching, is fusion number 2, which combines, I missed something to draw on here, which combines Zinogre once again and Nargacuga. Our next project that we'll work on, may have time to get some preliminary stuff together as far as a primary. The next one will be fusion number 3, which will be Narga and Volvidon. And the last one, and potentially most difficult of the entire triple fusion project, will be the 4th one, which will take elements from 1, 2, 3 and combine them all together to create one final fused creature that has attributes from all 3 of the fusions. And that's a key thing to keep in mind, because it's not a combination of all 3 base creatures. It's a combination of their fusions and the elements from their fusions. And that can get tricky when you have really complicated creatures that you're already putting together to create something that doesn't look like it was an unholy chimera created in a lab. But if we compare our starting point, where is it? If we compare our starting point for the fusion we worked on today, this was the preliminary sketch that I had drawn before the stream, just as a rough set of ideas for the creature. What we ended up going with in today's session, I think gives us a lot more room to work. That's what I mentioned when we were talking about this earlier. This one's not bad from an idea perspective, but I think this particular pose and drawing is harder to work with when it comes to showing all the different features of the fusion. And that's what we got here. I'm going to label this Fusion 2. So I don't have trouble finding this one later. What we could do to sort of wrap up the session is start coming up with some ideas for number 3. Maybe nothing final, but we can start thinking about some ideas for body type, base pose, and give us something to work off of for next time. I think what I may do, I haven't quite decided with the order I want to work on these, but the next major drawing stream that focuses on this fusion project is going to be inking, coloring, and shading and rendering number 2 that we sketched today. But if we think about some potential ideas to get us started for number 3, we could talk about that a little bit, and then we'll wrap up the stream for today. Let me keep the diagram here. Let's see, this one down here. Okay. I'm gonna flip this one. Move it up in the hierarchy here. And try and put it into position. This particular pose ended up looking kind of resembling the one that we went with today. I didn't quite plan it that way. But looking at the first version of this primary, I'm going to hide the diagram here. For the base body type and sort of species classification exercise we went through for fusion number 2, for 3 here, I made some decisions, and I'm not necessarily married to the ideas that we had in this initial sketch, but I think it's going to give us a good place to work from. So what does it tell us? It tells us that the base body type for this particular creature, while not quite as bulky in build as fusion number 2, the body type is going to be a flying type wyvern, even though this thing doesn't have wings. It'll be flightless, but still technically be classified in the same species as Narga. And the idea that I was kicking around for fusion number 3 would be a more medium build creature that focuses on the idea of armor. If we take a look at our sample components here in the fusion, Narga's got the sleek design meant for speed, agility, and stealth. Volvidon is built for defense and endurance and withstanding damage. So if we were to take the defensive elements and sort of shell-like qualities that you see on Volvidon and combine them with the agile and lighter build of Narga, you get something like a predatory wyvern that's well armored with a protective shell. And I think that would be a good contrast from the previous one we did, which was a bit more of a, again, a heavier brawler type creature that's not going to rely on stealth or speed so much as just brute force. So keeping that in mind, and keeping our original primary here, I like the idea of a more slender creature that has a build that's going to be more in line with what we see on Narga. But from a pose perspective, I kind of want to build on this one here and differentiate it slightly from the one we did today. So the last part of the stream exercise here, in order to give us a place to work from in the future, I want to experiment around with some ideas on how we want to set up the pose for fusion number 3. Originally what I was thinking was building on this particular idea and having the head sort of turned, looking over its shoulder. But it might work out better to have the head facing in one direction. Or we could even do more of a side pose. The idea just popped in my head. I'll hide that. We could even do something like this. This is just a rough sample sketch trying to get some ideas down here. Again, not going for a really bulky build. A bit more on the slender side. The base doesn't necessarily need to be that bulky, because once we go in and add armor, it's gonna add some heft. Oh, these back legs always give me trouble. Could do something like this, where we've got a mostly side profile perspective, It's almost more of a ready to pounce type of position. I get something like this. I'm going to start erasing some of the lines here to give me more of a defined shape for the primary. Also messing around with tail position here. Because this particular creature is going to be more heavily armored, but still somewhat designed for speed. The idea of using its tail like an armored club instead of a whip is an interesting idea. Alright, while I'm scaling things up here and sort of erasing a lot of the placeholder parts of the sketch, let's compare this with the fusion components again. The way I envision this sort of working, if we, again, read ahead to what we'll be doing on the actual dedicated drawing session for Fusion number 3, I foresee a lot of the plating that we're seeing on Volvidon covering things like the back, torso, maybe the limbs. Maybe we could do something like give it spurs on its forearms as a way to incorporate the elements from Narga's blades, since it won't have wings, but it could still have weapons as a holdover from its parent. And I definitely think keeping the long anteater-like tongue is going to be important. One way to incorporate the design elements could be to give it hands and claws similar to Volvidon. It has these kind of unusual looking nails on its hands. I don't know what kind of animal that's taken from. It's got to be some sort of naturally occurring creature, since when the Monster Hunter creature design team designs creatures, they take elements from animals found in nature and they incorporate different elements. So all of the things here came from some sort of naturally occurring creature in some form. I wonder if it's like a mole or some sort of digging animal where they got these unusual claws. But giving those forelimbs to our fusion creature could be a good way of switching things up. What I'll do is I'll just start getting rid of some of the placeholder stuff, and we'll leave the rest there. In the event I want to edit some things with this particular pose, that'll be fine. I'm going to do some cleanup for my layer organization before I sit down to work on this again. I know I've got everything sort of just in one big list, a bunch of sketches thrown everywhere, but I'll start organizing things into dedicated folders for the different fusion creatures, and we'll keep it organized that way. What I'll do is I'll keep these two for fusion number 3 handy, and think about how I want to incorporate the different design elements from the component creatures. I may end up going with pose number 2 that I just sketched real quickly here, just because it's going to distinguish itself a little bit from the one we did earlier in the stream. But a lot of these ideas, like the shell plating and everything else, I think will be something we carry forward. But we'll have to see. But to go ahead and summarize what we did and wrap up the drawing stream for today, our main goal was to come up with a working sketch primary for fusion number 2 of 4 total in our triple fusion project, using the design elements from Zinogre and Nargacuga. We put them together to come up with this prototype creature here. Don't need the arrows. And we started working on the primaries for fusion number 3. Like I mentioned a little while ago, when I come back to work on this project some more, inking, coloring, and rendering this particular one we did right here is going to be the next phase. And that's going to be an exercise in color theory, and experimenting, just like all the other crap we do here. But we have a temporary or tentative palette for a potential color scheme. So I think once the line art is done, it'll be a matter of just playing around with the colors and seeing what works and what doesn't. But I think that will do it for today's drawing stream. Just like the last one, I am sitting in a pool of sweat because it is incredibly hot in the recording space right now. When we get back together in a couple days for the next stream, we're going to return to Nocturne. The way I've planned out the streams for this week, we'll have one drawing stream today, which was this one, and then the next one will be making progress in Nocturne, and then the last gaming stream will be later on this weekend on Saturday. And I'll be trying something a little bit different again. I've never done a gaming challenge type thing on the channel so far, but I've got an idea for something that might be interesting. But we'll have to see how that goes when we get there. But that being said, I'd like to thank all the folks who dropped by to watch this fusion drawing process. Again, this was an experiment, an experimental format, and I'd like to revisit it again soon and keep working on the stuff we did here so it doesn't sit and I forget all the ideas we came up with. But that will be something we return to at a future date. So once again, thanks for coming and hanging out. I will catch you guys later. Have a good evening.